I'm Suzanne Barksdale Rice. I'm the president of Historic Lexington Foundation. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce David Cox. David was ordained in the Episcopal Church in 1972 and served from 1987 to 2000 as rector of R.E. Lee Memorial, now Grace Episcopal Church in Lexington. He left this position to continue doctoral studies. Thereafter, he served congregations in Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hot Springs. In 2008, he was elected to the Lexington City Council and served in that capacity for 4 years. Since 2006, he has been a professor of history at Southern Virginia University, teaching courses in liberal arts and history with a focus on American and religious studies and contemporary issues. His book, A Religious Biography of Robert E. Lee, appeared last year, and his new book, Lee Chapel at 150, was published this March and is available for purchase and signatures in the back following tonight's program. David will speak on the Great Chapel Controversy. David?
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you all for coming. I greatly appreciate this opportunity, and I'm glad to be here. Glad to see so many people from various aspects of my life, including SVU, and as well as the community at large. My thanks especially to Don Hasfurther and Beverly Tucker, as well as Suzanne, for this very kind invitation. This is the first time that I'll be having spoken publicly about this new book, so I welcome the opportunity and could not choose a more appropriate place and maybe a more timely moment. Well, I don't know. The book itself grew out, in a sense, of my religious biography, because when I was doing that, I came to realize that nobody had written anything on the origins of the chapel. Not even Olinger Crenshaw, in his history of the university, he doesn't even mention it. It's as though it sprang full-blown from the brow of Robert E. Lee. And so I went to see Lucy Wilkins, and we agreed that maybe something would be appropriate. And we aimed for the sesquicentennial to get it out. That turned out to be quite a challenge. And there's a lot of people who worked very hard to make this happen. And because this is the first time I can really address this publicly, I'd like to thank an awful lot of people. This is not an official book of Washington and Lee University, but it would not have been able to be done without the full cooperation of the school. President Dudley, some of you might have heard that he had some very kind remarks at the graduation last week. He also gave you such a summary. You don't just read his I shouldn't say this in Byron's presence. You can get a good summary from what he said. But he did read it, but he wanted to make sure that this would not be officially sanctioned by the university, which would allow me the opportunity, of course, to say what I think. Dennis Cross gave a very good reading, as did Julie Campbell. Pat Hobbs was extremely helpful, particularly on the more recent history. Taylor Sanders and particularly Holt Merchant gave careful readings to the book. Special collections, I lived over there for years, and I'm so grateful to Tom Camden, Seth Goodhart, Lisa McCowan, and particularly Byron Fadley, whose name is going to pop up more than once. At Lee Chapel, I've already mentioned Lucy, who could not be with us tonight, and Cassie Ivy, who can be, and Byron, who wears a number of hats, but he is particularly, he's going to be selling the books afterwards, but over Special Collections, he was the one that was really responsible for all of the illustrations, and I'm so pleased and very grateful. Mariner Media did incredible work in getting this out. They did about a year's worth of work in 4 to 6 weeks. And Andy Wolf is here, Lisa Tracy, who read the book as well, and in some cases saved me from some serious errors. Emily Davis, Judy Rogers, and Karen Porter Bowen did really yeoman's work in getting this out, and I am very, very grateful. I want to talk about one of the 2 chapters or incidents in the life of the chapel that particularly intrigued me. The first one was its origins. As I mentioned, nobody talked about that. No research had been done. And I was very interested in what inspired President Lee to create the chapel and why and how he did so. And that's going to be my topic when I speak in October on the Remembering Lee program at the time, I think it's October the 8th. Tonight I want to talk about a different incident in the life of the chapel. If the one has to do with the creation of it, the other had to do with its very near destruction of the chapel as we know it. And this, in fact, was researched. 3 people had written about it with great insight, and all 3 happened to be very good friends. Winifred Hadsell, Pamela Simpson, and about 20 years before they did, Matt Paxton, who is here tonight. And I'm plagiarizing the title of his fortnightly paper that he gave in 1961 when the chapel was being redone thanks to the Ford Motor Company, and talk about the great chapel controversy of the 1920s, a controversy in which his grandfather, the editor of the Rockbridge County News, played a very significant role. Now, I understand why they wrote about it, because I found it so fascinating that my 1 chapter turned into 3. It is a fascinating story of conflicting visions, of overweening pride and institutional arrogance, and, as Pam Simpson put it, how a little group of willful women saved the Shrine of the South, and in so doing saved us from a result that, well, I'll let you judge for yourself. It begins with the presidency of Henry Louis Smith. The English critic Cyril Connolly once wrote, "Whom the gods would destroy, they first call promising." Well, among college presidents, Henry Louis Smith was promising. At a young age, he became president of Davidson, and then a dozen years later came to Washington and Lee. It was right around the time of World War I. He had big ambitions for himself and particularly for the school. And after the war, he really went at it in a big way. Students were flocking to W&L as they had actually after the Civil War when Lee was here. And both presidents faced the challenges of growing pains. As enrollment exceeded 700 and kept on rising, Smith had no space where the entire student body could meet. That was one of Lee's objectives in creating this space. Now, But by 1919 or so, this was too small to house the growing student body, much less the faculty as well. And besides, it was decrepit. It had been neglected for decade after decade after decade. It could have been ignited by one of the visitors smoking their cigarettes. Can you imagine? Or maybe exploding from the antiquated heating system. It was a fire trap, in other words. Old Lexingtonians called it a sorry old building. And those visitors, whether or not with cigarettes, were increasing in number. This was a time when the Americans were rediscovering their past. And not only that, they were enabled by people like Henry Ford to go traveling to see the sights of their past. This was a particularly and increasingly popular one. So the university, on the other hand, was ill-equipped to welcome them. The chapel was staffed by volunteer students and cadets who had the habit of going away for the summer when they were sometimes most needed. So what were they to do? So that was a problem. So by 1919, Smith was developing a number of plans, and one of them was to see about getting regular staffing here at the chapel. And he looked, not illogically, to the Virginia division of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. He persuaded them to provide for what they called a custodian, who would oversee the well-being of the chapel in general and make sure that visitors were welcomed and educated and had a good experience here. But that also meant that an outside organization had an interest in the chapel's well-being, and that would come back to haunt him. But Smith had still grander visions. He wanted a cohesive student body, but he also wanted a cohesive campus in design. And nothing said college campus in those days like red brick and white columns. Now, Washington and Lee did have those red bricks and white columns, but the chapel rather contrasted with it. Here we have a picture on the left of the chapel in about 1910 or so. You can see the ivy has begun to take over. Already it was being seen as a special place. The postcard there, which is of the same vintage, calls it no less than the Westminster Abbey of the Confederacy. Well, there were a lot of people who thought that it should be used for sacred purposes only, like religious services, those have pretty much died off, and academic affairs. As you can see, it wasn't always, much to the disgust of Mary Custis Lee, Lee's daughter. So there too were some issues that Smith had to deal with. So in terms of the exterior, though, the chapel hardly resembled the white bricks, the white columns and red brick of the colonnade. Now, on the left you see Dartmouth, which was being rebuilt at the time by architects who were very into neo-colonial architecture, and so that was the way a college should look. Well, Washington and Lee had a certain advantage on that because we already had a lot of red bricks and white columns. Of course, not the chapel. Well, so Smith got together with the rector, who was William Anderson. He had been Attorney General, as you can see, and he had also served under Lee in the war. On the right is Leonora Rogers Schuyler, whom we'll mention in a little while. But Smith and Anderson formed a good team, and they shared the vision of a renovated, revitalized campus, not only in a better student body, but in a more cohesive design. So that was one objective. A second objective was to have a place where the entire student body could gather. Makes sense. Again, that was Lee's objective in creating this place at the very first. And then there was a third, a place to honor Lee. That, he felt, was not being done by the old Victorian pile of bricks that he saw. It is General Lee's tomb, he argued, not the chapel, which is and will ever be the South's most sacred shrine. He needed a building to encase that shrine worthy of Lee. Now, please understand, and for Smith, this part doesn't matter. It's this part and downstairs and the office. That's the shrine. Well, he knew that in order to pull off this vision, which he did not share with many people, he would need help. And the UDC was there for him. They agreed in 1919 to provide for a custodian. This was the Virginia Division. Well, the National Convention agreed in that same year on his plan for, and I quote, the renovation and enlargement of the Lee Memorial Chapel, unquote, which was part of a larger effort to honor Lee not only with the chapel and with the custodian, but also by making permanent the journalism department and extend some engineering programs in the school. Well, now, the renovation and enlargement of the Lee Memorial Chapel, what does that mean? Well, enter Benjamin Cortlandt Flournoy, class of '97, who was the university architect. He had created the post office in Lee and Nelson in 1912. He was the architect of Doremus Gymnasium. He told Smith that to provide a worthy setting for the Lee statue and an auditorium adequate to the needs of the university, an almost complete demolition of the present structure will be necessary, in which only the shrine, as Smith defined it, namely up here, is retained. So he set to work and he created what he called a building of the Pantheon type with a circular auditorium 82 feet in diameter. I hope you can see it here. See the dome here? And notice, guess what this is made of? Red brick, white columns. And here's the interior. And notice that this auditorium, every seat gives a good view of the Lee statue, right here. So that was his idea. And it would seat 1,000 people. Well, one scheme followed another. This one apparently didn't last too long. Whoops. The first thing he did was he didn't square the circle, he made it into an octagon, but again, you've got the same principle of this auditorium where everyone can see Lee's statue. Well, then he put a great big tower on it like this, and here's an interior shot, and this is the next iteration after this, and you can see then he starts putting on some wings, but notice at this point, if you're sitting over here, not everybody can see the Lee statue, so he's beginning to compromise. But this is what he imagined the front would look like. How do you like that? Let's see. Okay. Well, by 1920, this was the first watercolor that he created. And what do you notice about this? How about red brick and white columns? You'll notice there is a steeple, and notice at the top there is a cross. In this building, there is no religious symbolism whatsoever. That was what Lee had. So there's a little variant from Lee. The windows here are kind of similar, the Romanesque arch that is characteristic of what we have here. But other than that, doesn't look so much like it. So now all this time, the word had been kept pretty quiet about what Smith had in mind. But gradually, there were rumors that began to circulate that maybe he had something more in mind. But these really didn't come out until after the UDC met in 1921. And Smith and Anderson went to St. Louis and explained to the UDC a little bit more of what his plan was going to be. He dropped the word renovation and stressed the word enlargement. And he challenged the UDC to, again quoting, recognize General Lee's University as peculiarly belonging to the whole South, and thus worthy of support, especially for this great memorial movement, the enlargement of the chapel, to continue the work for which General Lee erected it, as well to safeguard it from fire, and to make it, again quoting Smith, more worthy of his name and fame. He promised it would change as little as possible, with the office and mausoleum untouched. The UDC approved this overwhelmingly, and no one was more on board than the President General Lenora Schofield. Well, after that November meeting, word about what he had in mind, rumors of this kind of design, began to spread through Lexington. If you don't know, Lexington is a small town. It's kind of hard to keep secrets for very long. So on the first day of 1922, Mrs. Elizabeth White, the wife of Dr. Reed White, who lived at right behind the post office at the corner of Nelson and of Lee, invited Anne Norvell Odie Scott to discuss the situation. Mrs. Scott was the UDC representative for Virginia overseeing the custodian program, so she would come over to Lexington from Lynchburg on occasion. And they got together and they found that they mutually had some rather deep concerns. So Mrs. White called together the membership of the UDC at her home, and they agreed to write their concerns to Mrs. Schuyler, to John W. Davis, who was an alumnus on the Board of Trustees, who would be the presidential candidate in 1924 for the Democrats, and also Mrs. Robert E. Lee III, whose grandson of President Lee, who was on the Board of Trustees. They shared their concerns and got no response. Well, Flournoy kept working. Oh, here we have Mrs. White, and then Bessie Davis and Matthew Paxton. Does he look at all familiar? Will enter into our story momentarily. Well, in April, Flournoy produced this. This is the side you see from Route 11. And you can see that the old tower is completely gone. In fact, there's not much left of the old building whatsoever. And here is the floor plan where you have the shrine part here, and then all of this is totally new with, of course, the requisite columns. Enter now Matthew Paxton. On the 29th of June in 1922, Matthew Paxton, class of 79, declared, "The Rockbridge County News has felt deep resentment at the proposed demolition of Lee Memorial Chapel, for that is what is meant." And with that declaration, the floodgates opened. He immediately got an outpouring of letters from all over the place supporting him in his concern. The ladies of the UDC in the Mary Custis Lee chapter here in Lexington met at the home of Mrs. Cleveland Davis, whose picture you just saw. She lives in Suzanne Reed's house on Jackson Avenue. And basically, they mutinied. They started a letter-writing campaign. They drafted resolutions to present to the Virginia meeting of the UDC in October. And Smith and Matt Paxton kept on writing. Smith counterattacked. President Smith minimized Lee's role, but stressed his purpose that he saw being met by this. He argued that it held the unanimous approval of faculty and, he thought, trustees, and nobody had objected, he said. Well, Editor Paxton retorted point by point as meanwhile the letters kept pouring in from all over. In October, Smith and Anderson went to Fredericksburg to present their case to a very hostile but polite UDC meeting, Virginia meeting, and they made their case. The next day, Mrs. Davis stood up and proposed their resolutions from the Lexington chapter, which were overwhelmingly approved, fighting this plan. These resolutions were to be taken to the national UDC meeting in Birmingham in November. That came. Anderson and Smith went down there. They made their case, and they won. Mrs. Schuyler made sure of it. The UDC reaffirmed their support, much to the tears of the Virginia delegation. That was late 1922. But Smith began to realize that his victory might have been a bit Pyrrhic. He conceded that many of General Lee's most devoted admirers, especially in Virginia, had learned through long years to revere the Lee Chapel as a sacred memento. And so, the trustees on March 26, 1923, announced, "The building will remain unaltered. This definite and final decision ends a controversy affecting the whole Southland, except for one minor little detail." Look at that. Is the chapel, in your opinion, unaltered? How many of you think it is? How many of you would tend to disagree? Yeah, there are more hands for that, I noticed. Well, that was the reaction that it got. You cannot call something unaltered and then put another auditorium on the other side of it, but that was the plan. On this side would be an auditorium that would open up into the Lee statue chamber while keeping this. But also, notice over here, what do we have? Got to have those columns. And gone is what Smith called that ugly old tower. Not exactly unaltered, but that was what he pushed. He had talked with Ralph Adams Cram and other leading architects of the nation, the National Fine Arts Commission, and emerged with what the trustees and he called the final solution of the Lee Chapel problem, a plan for enlarging the Lee Chapel by addition instead of by reconstruction, thus leaving the present chapel substantially unchanged. Oh, I'll get it right. Now, here's, by the way, here's an overall plan, you see. And notice this little thing, too. Anybody ever see the Lee Monument in Richmond? Imagine that down at the corner of Lee and Jefferson and Main, of Main Street and Jefferson, right at the intersection. But that's what they had in mind. Well, by April, Flournoy had produced this beauty. And in July, he had modified it, thanks to the advice of others, and to this. Here, this part here is the front of the chapel, the original chapel. Notice, a porch with columns. And then this is this addition. And it's hard to see, but here and here are statues that would be sentries, I suppose in Confederate uniform, guarding these entrances to the chapel. Well, this is what the New York Times pictured on October 14 with a story with big headline, "South's long dream of memorial to Lee nears realization." Smith, it is quoted in the article, declared, "We should all rejoice together that a problem so perplexing and on which there was honest difference of opinion should be so successfully solved." To which we might say, yeah, right. The response was immediate and predictable. Lee Chapel, add to it nothing more. That became the cry. Marietta Menegrode Andrews, who was a leading artist, head of the Monticello Association, declared, add a separate auditorium. Don't mess up with the chapel. There was a letter-writing campaign led by Dr. and Mrs. Morris Moore of Lynchburg, and they wrote alumni, newspapers, politicians, celebrities like H.L. Mencken or a guy named John Drinkwater, whom I'll mention in a second, anybody they could think of, just letters left and right. Just the two of them circulating this throughout the country, particularly the East and the South. John Drinkwater was an English playwright who had just put on a play about Lee in New York. He wrote, "A building like the Lee Chapel has really become the property of the American race. And whatever you or I or anyone might think of the fitness of the building or otherwise, it really ought to be beyond our powers to touch it." As Christmas 1923 approached, one newspaper after another editorialized, all of them against it. And the alumni, well, they were voting in various ways with their letters and in the other ways that alumni may express their opinions. So, at its meeting on Lee's birthday, January 19, 1924, Smith and Anderson bowed to the inevitable. Davis drew up articles of surrender. In the opinion of the board, it is inexpedient to proceed with the plans heretofore proposed and discussed in relation to the Lee Chapel. Smith and Anderson walked out of the meeting room, arm in arm, in defeat. There is a postscript, however. Remember, I mentioned the idea of a separate auditorium that would house the student body. Well, Mr. Flournoy had some ideas, and there it is. Look a little familiar? That was his idea of a memorial auditorium that would go somewhere down here. This is what it would look on the inside. Notice we have a life-size person here and a statue here. I wonder who it was that he had in mind. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of glad they didn't get past that one. So that idea never gained any traction whatsoever. I do know that the university has raised the possibility of a separate auditorium that would in fact seat the entire university community. And I guess we could say that, there are some plans available. But personally, I'm not sure that we ought to follow those. Well, what can we say of all of this? I think one is that if you're going to make a big change, full transparency can often be helpful. That was not one of President Smith's gifts. You could also say, in a sense, that David slew Goliath, or maybe it's Davidia slew Goliath, that little group of willful women assisted by what Smith called an ultra-conservative male editor. Notice this is right around the same time that the 19th Amendment had taken effect and women had voted for the first time in the 1920 election. These were not, however, progressive women by any stretch of the imagination, but they were also not seen as powerful. Smith had ignored them completely. Mrs. Schuyler had ignored them and dismissed them completely. When she came to town to visit Smith, she never saw the women of the local chapter. But they were the ones who got the ball rolling that kept Lee Chapel as we know it in place. Why did Smith ignore them? It's unclear. Maybe it was a case of arrogance or of male chauvinism. Maybe he took them for granted. Maybe he made the mistake of appealing to the high and mighty, the people on the national UDC level, for example, while ignoring those in his own neighborhood, but they were the ones who demonstrated the power that a small, determined group can have. Notice also the emotional power that a building can have. As Suzanne mentioned, I've spent a lot of my life in the church, and any pastor soon knows that any changes to the church need to be approached with great delicacy. We were talking beforehand about the cushions in the pews that you now enjoy. Those took about 30 years to get in place, and over at the Presbyterian Church, they've been talking about it for 15 years, we were agreeing, and so it's 15 years more before there's going to be cushions in Lex Pres, but it'll come. You know, buildings have power, architecture has power. And it's an emotional power and sometimes a spiritual power. It's an amorphous power, but it's a power nonetheless. There's another facet of this, that in the process, the nature of the chapel itself was redefined. It had been the college chapel, and the college didn't pay much attention to it. There were some events, but not a lot. Well, in the course of this saga, it strengthened the association of the chapel with Lee. Not just what Lee defined as the shrine, the part up here, but the entire building. It intensified the connection that this place had with the Confederacy. That was seen about 10 years later with the addition of Confederate flags on a more permanent basis. But it also intensified, as Drinkwater implied, its connection with the nation as a whole. This was a time when Lee was being seen more and more, not just as a Southern hero, but as an American figure of prominence. In 1913, a New Englander named Gamaliel Bradford wrote the first biography by a Yankee of Lee called Lee the American. And in 1961, it was declared a National Historic Landmark by the Department of the Interior. And there was one more result. The university paid more attention to it. The university took better care of it, and that has continued, particularly after 1960. It saw to the creation of a museum downstairs. And what happens now? Wouldn't you know that just as I published the book, there's a possibility of another chapter as this history opens. We don't know where it will lead, but it will be interesting to find out. Thank you. We have some time for some questions, and Cassie has a microphone so that we can all hear you.
If you have a question, if you'll just raise your hand and I'll get to you as quick as possible.
Leon.
What role did President Lee's son, who was teaching at VMI, play in
Oh, that's a good question to get you back here in October. Actually, the building was pretty much designed by Custis Lee and his superior on the faculty, Thomas Holmes Williamson. Custis owned a book about the Smithsonian Institution. And these windows, for example, are exact copies of what we have. The tower is borrowed from the Smithsonian. That was a very common thing. Both Custis and Williamson had interests in architecture. And so they were the ones who were primarily responsible for the design itself. But President Lee took an active interest. In the book, you'll see a picture of one of the sketches of the interior, and you can see, if you look closely, there are penciled scribblings in Lee's hand about where different things go. So he took an active interest, but it was really Williamson and Custis Lee who led the effort to design it in the first place.
Thank you for this. Is it working?
I'm sure I can hear you, Carrie.
Great. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say in October. So now here's a very challenging question. Having been director of the Robert E. Lee Church, which had its name changed, and watched what's happened in the last year in this country with the statues of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville and other places, what should we do? And especially what should we do to avoid all the intense, horrible polarization and refighting of the Civil War and the legacy of slavery?
What should we do in the present moment? That question is so far above my pay grade. There's no way I could answer it, nor would it be my place to, even if I had some answers. I do think, as an historian, I will put in a plug for taking a good look at history, because I think it's important to get our history straight, to try, to shun the easy answers and the stereotypes, and to try to get our facts right, and to learn what we can. Now, I will tell you that when the name change was being considered over at the Episcopal Church, I tried to take no side one way or another, but I was at that point putting out the biography of Lee. And so I tried to present the person of Lee as I understood him. And I've had more than one person come up to me and say, well, gee, as a result of this, I could go either way. And I said, precisely. So I leave it with you. I encourage you to learn from history and reach your own judgments. But thank you. Now, having said that, I've also actually have been asked to mention that if you do have comments, they are being sought by the Commission and by President Dudley, and you can share them at commissionreport@wlu.edu. So, other questions or comments?
I want to comment. As the guy who read it first, I should say, as the guy who read it first and the book before, I have to, and is Lisa Tracy here?
She is.
Lisa was the story editor on this book, and it grew. This is 100% local.
It really is.
And shaped work that was immediately important, not just for the history in the past, but also as we look forward into the future. But I want to compliment David, because having read everything that you've written, that has been published at least, I think it's by far the best work that he's done. And he speaks with a very free and open voice. He's not guarded, and it is very frank. And I get nothing if you buy a book, but I certainly would encourage you to. And it is just a great, great product, and something that all of us in town can be very, very proud of. Thank you.
Between you and President Dudley, that's, thank you. Yes.
I mentioned this to you before. I attended Washington Lee High School in Arlington, Virginia, back in the 50s. Washington Lee High School, of course, has the same name as this school. We were very proud of that high school. It was amazing. There was a proposal, a very strong proposal among the county leaders, to change the name of Washington Lee just recently. It was interesting. I was amazed that the scholar dissertation went back and forth, but the efforts were very strong, remarkable historical research by the graduates of Washington Lee High School on keeping the name of Washington Lee intact. I was amazed at how strong it was just to remain in the historical research. This came out of Arlington County, Virginia, which is, of course, a very liberal county. And I grew up here. I was very appreciative. But I was very pleased to see there's a stay on the issue, and the presentations were remarkable by the graduates of Washington Lee High School.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, well, thank you all very much for coming. I wish you well. I hope this has given you something to ponder, and look forward to seeing many of you in October.